It's the final. No. All right, Quantum, get off my stage.
I can't do it.
I'll boot him off. Yeah. Wait,
Gaspar,
I can't. Okay. What's up?
welcome to the Thunderdome. Um, I hope you wore some clean underwear and you put identification tags somewhere on your body so we can ID you afterwards. Um, so tell us a little bit about yourself, Gaspar.
All right. Let's see. I like philosophy. I think that let's see. I think that philosophy has a certain dysfunctional way of being attached to categories that often don't represent the actual arguments for the positions that the categories are talking about. So I think that it's important, regardless of what one's view is in philosophy, to have some acquaintance with logic. Um, I can go around saying that I am I don't know, a determinist all day. But if that's all I say, it's kind of hard for someone to know why I'm a determinist. And then I might, if I don't know anything about logic, I might spit out some really asinine argument for determinism. And so I think it would be more efficient if someone knew logic and then they gave you their argument for determinism and just saved the label. So that's kind of what I think is important in philosophy. And I think a lot of people get, because they open with the labels and they often don't necessarily pursue it further or at least in enough depth, that this process of argumentation, and I mean logical argumentation, that I talked about is often overlooked or left out. So I think that the this fixation with titles in philosophy is a result and also a perpetuator of intellectual laziness.
All right. So let me. All right, I just paused the recording real quick. I just want to check one last time before we keep going with the whole conversation because I will be super pissed if it doesn't record.
All right.
All right. Yeah. Get off my screen.
I can't do it.
I'll boot him off.
Gaspar. Okay, we got it. Cool. All right. So. So, Gaspar, what got you interested in philosophy?
This is where we'll get into the interesting stuff right away. So I started doubting the Christianity that I was raised on. I would ask questions to the adults.
Stop right there.
I
Stop right there.
Okay, all right, yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah, what was the kind of Christianity that you were raised on? If you could you, I mean, like,
Yep.
okay,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Lots of people in these communities have heard me talk about how I was raised on in an Amish community. And so that's it's not as formal and ritualistic as as like say Catholicism or Orthodox Christianity. But okay, so fast forward a little bit to where my dad lived in the city, and me and my siblings lived with him. He got into Orthodoxy heavily, and so um yeah, so it was basically that I found that my questions would usually not be answered or answered in a satisfactory way. And then also within the Christian communities, whether it was Amish communities talking about other Amish communities or Orthodox Christians talking about other denominations, they were so judgmental about what could be perceived as trifles, like how to do certain rituals, etc. Dogmas. Now I know ideas are often of great consequence, so that was the other intimidating thing. If these ideas are of great consequence, then it's kind of hard to know which denomination was the one that needed to be followed, especially when there are so many powerful personalities behind each one, claiming that all sorts of authority or credibility. So I learned to look past authority, credibility, and talking head figures who claim to, I don't know, be inspired by this or that, and you know start experimenting for myself with my own philosophical thought and ponderings. But I was also going to a Catholic prep school by that time, and those usually are heavy in the liberal arts and philosophy stuff as well. And so, and there's a point where I was, in high school, and I was really existentially confused because I thought, oh man, all this Christianity is BS, and I really sometimes you hit an existential rock bottom where you're like, you know what, everyone's full of it. I know that at least. And then I saw in a book, and it was a very elementary logic book that was just for like the high school philosophy class. I saw the transitive property. It said A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. And I thought, well, hold on, I can get behind that. Um, and so the story is a little bit longer, but when I was 20, I learned symbolic logic, and I made sure to learn it like the back of my hand. And to me, that simplified a lot of philosophical issues because at the time I was also reading different philosophers and trying to study philosophy one ism at a time. And once I learned logic and learned what it was not, I went in with these assumptions that logic will be this thing that tells you what's true and that you'll learn these rules that are like the gears that turn the cosmos or something. And you realize it's not that. They're very abstract and hollow shells of things, and they leave you hanging. They teach you these rules of inference, but they leave you hanging as far as how to determine what is true. So I realized, oh, this pretty much simplifies a lot of philosophical problems. Some German philosopher could write a thick tome, and at the end of the day, the question will be, can you make a sound argument about any of that? And maybe the first, I don't know,
So,
but
would it be fair to say, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like you are part of a more uh, liberal Amish group, maybe Mennonites or similar to that?
nope, no, we kerosene lamps.
Oh,
Um,
okay. So you were okay. Um,
mhm,
Dutch, German.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So you were the real deal. Uh,
and they judged other Amish communities for driving vans to town to get
right.
various goods, and they'd be like, "Huh, they've really gone off the deep end." They would actually call them liberals. They said, "Oh, that community's gone liberal. You see them driving around in those vans."
Yeah.
So by the time I got to the city and saw, modern Christians judging each other, I was like, "Y'all don't even know. Y'all like where I come from. Y'all are like, degenerates."
Yes. A bunch of Satan's walking. Um,
Pretty much.
okay. So I want to prod into that a little bit more before we get in, to more of the philosophical stuff. However, um, any question that I ask, if you don't want to answer it, you don't want to go there, just say, no, I'm gonna pass on that one. Because I don't want to get too personal or, you know, bring up old things or stuff like that. Was it uh, a community that shunned you when you ultimately decided to leave, or
No.
okay,
Um, uh, in fact, I mean, they obviously don't agree that when people leave, but uh, I mean, me and my siblings still go back and visit from time to time. Like, during the COVID lockdown, it got so boring because everybody was just cooped up. I just decided to go that summer and hang out in the Amish community, you know, so I could at least go outside and stuff, be in nature. So instead of like, only having the option to go a couple places around town. So,
yeah.
and they're cool about it, So,
Well, that's cool. That's because I've heard some horror stories from certain Amish communities, and a lot of people look at the Amish and they think they're this monolithic group, and that couldn't be further, from the truth. Like you were talking about, I'm close here to Oklahoma, and we have a very traditional Amish community there, right around the corner from the Mennonites. So you have the Amish, with the buggies and everything, and then the Mennonites with their tractors. They don't drive, a whole lot of vehicles, but they drive the tractors like up and down the highways and everything else. And it's like, that's definitely a heathen right there. Um, so, what, when you started doubting it, at what age would you say that you were when you'd finally just kind of been convinced that Christianity's not true? And was there a deciding factor there?
let's see. Um, I think around age 15, I was like trying to salvage it in all these different ways, because I told my dad, I was like, "Hey, I have a question about all this." I get these like, I don't know, first cause arguments, the bread and butter that you still see people saying on the internet these days, things that resemble a cosmological argument. But then it's still like, okay, well, how do we get to, the Christian God and specifically the Orthodox faith from here? And I would like spend time sort of pacing around, trying to like rationalize. I'd be like, well, maybe they're not right about all the details in these denominations, but maybe God's like this force in nature or something. I don't know. And there was a point where, uh, uh, um, there's a point where I recognized that I was basically trying to contrive a solution instead of discover one.
Fair enough. Um, and I'm sorry, I missed what age did you say that was?
S Well, at 16 is when I finally decided that, regardless of whatever the state of affairs is, or whether it's terribly grim or not, I've got to be able to look at it I've got to be open to discover it, um, without having preconceptions about it. And I won't even begin the journey towards discovering it if I keep inventing what I think that discovery is.
Right. So on that note, and this is purely anecdotal, but I have noticed with a lot of my atheist friends, they were in that, 14 to 17, 18-year old range when they finally just said, I don't believe anymore. Uh, Also, I've noticed overwhelmingly that, and for any of my atheist friends here, or anybody that's listening to this is not a caricature of atheists. This is my experience. I'm in the southern United States. It may be totally different than atheists in other places, but an overwhelming number of it, or at least I've heard far more times than, alternative explanations. Um, there was some kind of uh, legalistic or fundamentalist church behind where they came out of. And the second common denominator is a lot um, developed a progressive or left leaning socio political stance, and they couldn't reconcile that stance with uh, the kind of Christianity that they were raised in, and kind of come to the conclusion that there's no way it can be true. Were any of those a factor, do you think? And
I've never cared about politics, and politics never had anything to do with
okay,
uh, this topic. Frankly, I consider people who are intellectually preoccupied with politics I put them in the same bin as a fundamentalist Christian. And I treat them with the same. I mean, I basically use the same dialogue strategies on them as I would with a precept. So uh,
well,
because
well,
they're
just yeah, just so you know, I'm interested in politics, so screw you. No, it's yeah, I know what you mean. It's so many people are ideologues today, and they really act like fundamentalists.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, your average yeah, yeah, it's just a messy topic, and I
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
I commit to trying to talk to people, and reconciling, uh, but I'm not going to. I haven't seen a side of the fence that impresses me, and I'm not going to throw in with one because it benefits me, and then have to turn a blind eye to the faults of that side. I'm not willing to take that on. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Uh, I wanted to go back for a second because there was a question that I wanted to ask um, before we get too far away from it. In your Amish community, I know many of those communities uh, believe and will also teach that, you know, salvation is, inextricably tied to the Amish community. And if you leave the community, there's no salvation. And I've known many Amish friends who they were, kind of like an iron rod, and it's probably more the fundamentalist, legalistic kind of reformed, maybe, and not reformed in the Calvinistic sense, but the reformed Dutch, I think it was. Was that something that you experienced?
Um, I don't know if it was as explicit as salvation had to be acquired within the community. It was more like it was a little bit softer than that. It's that the world is a place full of temptation, as the world as they called it. And so if people were driving cars, they were worldly, and if people were taking shortcuts with work, trying to use tractors, trying to use too many tools, too much technology, then they were starting to engage with the world. And yeah, so it was more like that kind of thing.
All right. And that was the last thing about the Amish I want. That was kind of one of the things I was thinking about. So another thing that I think about often is with the overwhelming amount of my experience with atheists being in the teenage years, do you think at 16, 17, 15, sometimes 14, that the mind is developed well enough to actually evaluate um, the arguments on, each side, or uh, to even really make a decision to uh, become an atheist, or become on the other side, to become a Christian? Because at 16, I'd be ashamed to talk about half the things that I cared about and what I was doing at 16. And it's hard for me, and I'll be transparent and honest with you. It's hard for me to look at somebody who deconverted from Christianity, especially a specific kind of Christianity, and you're kind of a unique case. Uh, and they, ever since then, they've never been convinced that Christianity's true or gone back to it. And I don't know how one at that age and the lack of development, in our cognitive abilities, It seems almost like as if one right in the most impressionable time, from a toddler to being 20 something, they make a decision like that. And it's like that becomes kind of part of their heuristic and who they are. Do you feel and some people are more mature at that age than others. Do you feel you had a pretty good grasp and understanding of, reality and this whole, existence of God question?
Okay, so that is a good point to bring up. Is a person in that age group, can they even be trusted basically to wipe their ass? Is basically what you're saying. And I'd say typically no. And I'm not the exception. In all these other ways, I was a dumb teenager. However, some of us have an affinity, and around that age is when I discovered my affinity for philosophy. In other words, you know, people word it differently. Some theists say, yeah, but there's got to be something else out there, right? And some of us have this intuition. The way I thought about it is, I think there's an answer to be discovered, and I just kind of trust that it's going to make sense. And so I would rather discover it than try to invent it. Um, and in order to do that, I had to have a clean slate. So I had this conviction that there were things that could be known, and that you have to be unbiased in order to discover them. So this was an area where I developed a genuine and authentic conviction. But it is true that uh, people at that age, and often into their 20s, for the most part, they're just repeating stuff, and they're worried about what other people think about them. And in many facets, I was no exception. But this was my passion. Like you get some kids who are good at this, good at that, and they're good musicians at an early age. This is what I really cared about. So the way I saw it is going through life not knowing what's going on is not worth it. I wanted to know. I was the sort of person who I thought, yeah, well, if there was a red pill and this was the Matrix, I would take the red pill. I don't care how terrible the reality is. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so you have some good points. One of the things one of the things that kind of came to mind when you were explaining that was can't so first of all, I like the fact you use the word intuition because I'm a strong intuitionist. Um I think, everything starts with intuition, and then we do our epistemic duty, to find rational, defensible positions according to, what our intuition is. And ultimately, we end back at intuition, what seems to be true to us. With that, you had said something that kind of caught my attention. Can one, because this is something that I try myself, and anybody who's, heard me talk about, my theism and the path I've took ad nauseum. It's I I try to be as objective as possible, but can one really truly be objective? Can we totally remove? I mean, we can't do it in a vacuum, obviously. But when you say objectively evaluate it, because I want to agree with you, I want to say that I try to as much as I can. But you would agree that no matter how hard we try, we still have some biases and presuppositions, right?
Yeah, so I agree. It's kind of hard to make the case what is actually objective, and so I'll settle for something different instead. I would like my judgments and my actions and such to be intentional rather than unintentional. So if we ask ourselves, what is actually wrong with biased thoughts and biased judgments? Well, it's that by and large they are often unintentional. And so, even if we have predispositions towards certain subject matter, or we come from places that have us think in a certain way, if if we keep it in mind and we act with intent, then it won't. Then we won't be engaging in the problematic unintentional behaviors that come from things like cognitive biases, etc. So it is not. No one is going to have the full like universal data set by which they can make inferences, and we're all going to have this imperfect and narrow view of things. However, we don't want that to lead us to make unintended decisions. And so I think it's important to understand what our biases are and and act with intent. So yeah, I am willing to totally give up on the idea of objectivity and settle for intent instead.
Yeah, that's a fantastic analysis and explanation. I would definitely um, be favorable towards that position because I think that in order, you like in anybody who spent any time in historiography, uh, i- if one doesn't, because everybody thinks that history is like this science, but there's a lot of art to it, and if one doesn't realize that we have presuppositions or biases, we can't. If you don't even recognize it, then how are you going to try and put it to the side to evaluate something? So I appreciate your honesty there, and I did want to say real quick, I am extremely grateful that you have come up here and been, for the transparency, the honesty, and willing to take, the questioning and things like that. And 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 kudos to you for that. The tenacity and confidence and willingness, to be open to us. So I really appreciate that, Gaspar.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's nice talking to you.
Yeah.
On a recorded stream, I don't mind answering questions about my Amish past, but I'm sure you relate to this. I'm a family man, and so like on a recorded stream, too much about like me and my family life is maybe I don't know, it just makes me uncomfortable. So
Yeah, I'm with
yeah,
you.
that's
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And that's why I wanted to kind of preface, some of those questions with, anything that you don't want to answer or things like that, just say pass and we'll move right past it. There's,
uh,
you know, so
yeah.
what I want to know is what is Christianity to you, your understanding of God, and what exactly is it that you're rejecting?
Okay. So um I um my face value take is that Christianity is a species of mythology, and my criticism of this particular mythology is that its members don't have the awareness that it's a mythology. They consider it to possibly be an exception, and they, in my opinion, break their backs trying to verify evidence that is way, way back in the ancient times, or trying to engage with arguments that can be valid all day, but who knows if they're sound. And in my opinion, this they're missing the point of if I'm right and it's a mythology and it isn't this literal historical system of cosmology, uh, then their attention would be better spent treating it as a mythology because mythology is meant to be evaluated under a lens of literary devices and literary elements. And it is, there are people, and I am one of them, who think um, literary symbolism has a bigger role to play in human cognition and life than mere entertainment. Sometimes our stories and metaphors can be mirrors that show us what we were what we were thinking, or remind us of opinions that we hold that maybe weren't front and center stage. And so uh, if we do not see it as such, then we might miss out on the whole lesson in the first place. So I consider Christianity to be a myth, and now your average atheist is going to use that as a slight. That is not a slight for me. I love mythology, and I think mythology is useful. In fact, even though we think maybe we are a secular society that is removed from mythology, we've just replaced our current mythology are things like meme culture and political narratives. So it doesn't go away. Um, and so that's what I think about it. Does that make sense?
Yes, sorry, I was pouring another drink. This segment's brought to you by Wild Turkey, the original, not the 100 proof. It's too much. So you agree though. Well, it doesn't matter if you agree or not. I'm sure you're aware that because something is in the genre or category of myth doesn't mean that it's fiction, right?
Um. Uh. Okay. Yeah. We could say that, but also, for example, in poetry, um, or even in writing in general, if something is too literal, it's crass. A writer's supposed to not spell everything out, but they're supposed to say as much as they can efficiently. And that is how literary symbolism is as well. And so if if I'm going to say that if the mythological symbolism is to be interpreted at its face value and literal meaning, then that is going to be a crass interpretation that would have been better delivered in the form of just like an essay or something, um, or something like that. And I understand that the Bible is a text, but if the events in there are certain events, certain whole sections of the Bible that um, I don't know, it's kind of hard to make sense of them without. I think the most charitable interpretation is a mythological one. You know, like I know you're not. You say you are not a young Earth creationist, okay? And so you probably say that Genesis is symbolic or something. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but um, you know,
Yeah, yeah. Don't straw man me, Gaspar. Um,
yeah.
um, so my position would be that first of all, the Bible is not a book. The Bible's a collection of literature, some that's meant to be historical, whether it's historical or not, that's a different debate. But some of it is meant to be historical, and a lot of Jews today hold to a lot of it as being a lot of parts of it being historical. Some of it's meant to be theological. Um, it and I think that that's where uh, that's where I run into an issue. So my issue is if somebody is an atheist, so first of all, if I'm having a discussion with them and I let them define atheism however they want, but I know that as much time you spend in philosophy, atheism is typically the negation of theism. It's defined uh, by what theism is, and th- even though it's a negation, it's still a proposition. So what I would say is let's concede that the whole Bible is myth, and myth in the mythos sense that it's even got a lot of fiction in it and all of this. How does it follow from that that a God doesn't exist?
Um, it doesn't. necessarily follow that a God doesn't exist, and it doesn't follow that a God does exist. In fact, I don't know what follows from that.
Okay, but that's honest, great answer. Because there's the reason I ask that is because quite often when I have a discussion, you know me, and a lot of people here do, and if anybody's going to listen to this later who doesn't, um, I, I don't, I'm not an apologist. I defend my views because I want my views to be defensible, rational, um, and with that, uh, I have a lot of atheists that I interact with that they go straight to contradictions in the Bible. The flood couldn't be scientifically true. The Earth can't be 6 to 10,000 years old, and they don't realize that there's a lot of assumptions built into those statements. But still, at the end of the day, you toss the whole Bible out. Doesn't mean atheism's true. It doesn't mean theism is false. So, what got you from rejecting Christianity to no God at all, not even a deistic God or some kind of pantheist, you know, consciousness, or how did you go from rejecting the Christianity to just saying no God exists?
That might not have been as far as I go. Okay. It might have been more of a, I'd say what's more accurate is a Russell's teapot situation. It's like, okay, I'm not convinced by this. So, uh, until I have reason to be convinced by it, I'm going to move on to other things that I think could be convincing. Um, and so let's see. There's a lot of different definitions of God. So, like you mentioned, these other, pantheism or whatever. I know some pantheists who they say the universe is God, and so this is where kind of some of my pragmatism comes in. Um, I like my made up ideas to be useful, and so I don't know what the use is. I don't know what I get out of labeling the universe as God. Maybe that's good in a literary work or a myth because anthropomorphization is one of the best ways to communicate in those contexts. But in others, I might just keep calling the universe the universe. And so it's not that I say there is no pantheistic God, it's that I don't see the use in rebranding the universe. So that's like what's the case with that, right? That instance. And then there's this whole spectrum of all these other definitions of God, and they're all kind of with me on a case by case basis. But what I would say the common thread is that at least in any deductive sense, and probably in an inductive sense, I don't see anything leading to them. Okay. But now, what you mentioned is atheists going straight to contradictions in the Bible. With me, if the Bible is seen as a myth or a collection of literary works, or it is interpreted as metaphor, then the contradictions are not a problem for you. So that's what I tell my Christian friends that uh, if you take it literally, then you get the hammer of logic. um,
Yeah. It's,
if you take it metaphorically, you are completely off the hook, in my opinion.
well,
You can have your Trinity. You don't have to explain why it is or isn't a contradiction. Uh, Literary symbolism is often just literally just contradiction after paradoxical contradiction, and that's part of the strength of it. It adds meaning to things, and I don't know how people don't recognize that that's what some of this stuff is. But if I turned around and I tried to make sense of one of these kinds of poems, then yeah, I'd be kicking my own ass. But so that's my option for the Christian is they uh, take it metaphorically and then have a big sigh of relief because now you don't have as much work as you used to have. Or if you take it literally, um, deal with the contradictions, which it almost ends up being kind of an indirect proof sort of things. Like with indirect proof, they say, oh, if you derive a contradiction, then we automatically know that can't be the case. Now, this is true in classical logic, at least. And for some reason, my theistic friends are married to consistency, logically speaking. So yeah, that's how I look at that. So I understand most atheists go for those contradictions as a big fatality. I don't think that's what it is. I think it is a myth, and that those contradictions are okay. But what's not okay is that people don't understand the material they're working with, and so they don't realize it's a myth, and they treat it like something else.
So there's so many places I want to go. Um, well, first I want to say, after listening to you restate what I said back to me, it seems that there's a way that could have been interpreted uncharitably, and I wanted, to clarify and apologize. Um, I didn't mean to imply you went straight from rejecting Christianity to being an atheist. I was more wondering the journey, once you rejected Christianity, how you got to atheism.
Oh, okay. So
So,
you weren't saying, how did you take
yeah,
this and draw this conclusion? How it's
right,
more, how
right.
did my ideas evolve? Okay, I understand.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And after you had kind of replied and restated it, I was like, oh, that's not what I
Okay.
meant.
So then
So,
let me answer that actual question. Um, it's kind of like, I guess, um, ex-girlfriend or something, or if you're a girl listening is an ex-boyfriend. It's like, okay, hurts for a while. You're still thinking about whether they're gonna call, and then one day you're not thinking about it anymore. That's what it
yeah.
is.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I get that. Going through a deconstruction myself, which on a little side note and tangent, I've been instructed by, not directly, by one of my philosophy friends on Facebook that deconstruction has nothing to do with losing faith or changing your view, and went into the Renaissance and all of this. And I'm like, bro, whatever. Anyway, so a couple things I wanted to clarify and maybe even correct you on. One, to say take it literal or metaphorical is a false dichotomy. The second one is uh, we absolutely should take it literal. But what I mean by literal is as literature. And when we approach it as literature, there are uh, and this is more for the audience than you. For anybody else that's listening, I know you know a lot of this stuff. Uh, when we approach, especially ancient texts and a collection of texts, there is a science and an art to it. And the science is there's a method, a minimal method that's required. The art is actually in the interpretation and where to put things and how they fit and all this. You have to take we have, specific standards that has to be followed. You have to know what or you let me take that back. You don't have to know. You have to try as much as possible to put yourself in the position of this culture, which is totally different than ours. It was collectivist, it wasn't individualistic like ours. Uh, there were so many different social mores, things we think are sins here wouldn't have been there, and there it's here. So we have to approach it as literature, and when we approach it as literature, we need to know what the genre of the book is. For example, the book of Hebrews is a preaching book. It's called a homiletic. Well, homiletics, preaching books, were just like the pastor on Sunday giving a sermon. He doesn't mean for every single little word that he says to be true. It's the theological message that comes out of it. He's painting a picture, he's giving parallels, he's doing all these things. So we need to know what the genre is. We need to try and see what the author was trying to convey and how the people at that time with their understanding would have received that. And if there's any specific things, such as like with Paul's letters to the churches, Paul was speaking specifically to certain churches with certain issues. Well, in literature, you have what's called literary devices. The literary devices are there's metaphor, there's simile, there's hyperbole, there's the you have the face value interpretation, you have allegory. There's all kinds of literary devices that are used in literature, and that's no different for ancient texts as it is now. In fact, it's even a little more difficult. This is not a failure of you and and reading scripture or taking scripture. This is a failure of the church because with Protestantism came an increasing anti-intellectualism and this idea that we can take this all of these ancient cultural texts, put them in our language, put them in a book, and then we can all go home and read this book, and somehow the Holy Spirit is magically going to illuminate to us the truth. And I won't even get into the whole history of how that came about. So I would agree, we have to take it literally as literature. We have to take into account all the things that I'd laid out. There is myth in scripture. It's not all myth. Um, I don't think you're not a Jesus mythicist, are you?
Let's see. So I don't know whether Jesus existed, and I can neither confirm nor deny it. And if I was a Christian, that wouldn't be a problem for me because, I would see him as a mythological figure.
Oh, I wouldn't. No. I wouldn't even be a Christian. Come on, Gaspar. It's okay.
All
Let
right,
me.
all
Let me.
right. So then that's the bullet you bite. If you have to take it literal, then you have this
No, no,
massive
no,
skyscraper of problems.
no. Wait a minute. Hold on. What I was going to say is, I know what you meant by that, and I didn't parse out exactly what I meant by mythicism. What I mean is, there more than likely was a historical Joshua, which would have been Hebrew Yehoshua, and he was a rabbi, and he was popular, and he was charismatic, and he had a following. I don't mean that we have to take all of the. I mean, I'm talking about just starting at ground zero. We don't have to agree that all the miracles happened, that he resurrected, and all these things. I'm just talking about as a historical figure. Uh, you wouldn't agree that it's more than likely that Jesus existed at least as a historical figure that these stories spurned out of?
Yeah, so I just don't know. Okay, I have no way of knowing that, in my opinion. And anything anyone's ever told me about it, witnesses, this, that, and the other. I don't, yeah, whatever.
And okay, so I understand you. Um, and I want this to be more about, learning about Gaspar and his views and not necessarily a debate. Uh, but I mean, are you critical of knowing figures from history, period? Or is this a special case with Jesus? You don't rely on like historical methods or different kinds of historiography? How do you approach that?
So like with things like Adolf Hitler, I think he was probably real because we have footage of him and stuff. And uh, now the further we go back, I don't know. Let's first classify historical knowledge as empirical, somewhere under the umbrella of induction. And so we need observable cases from which to extrapolate our inductive conclusion. And we all know that there's no cut and dry way to do that. But as we go further and further back, our set of evidence becomes less and less reliable. I think most people would probably agree on that. That's not to say there is nothing to discover. Like, for example, if we go to where Rome was and we discover a clay pot and we use our dating tools, we can be like, okay, this clay pot is from this time. But then, like, if we want to know whether Socrates's ideas were perfectly translated from Plato, because Socrates didn't write stuff down, but his students did. I don't know. So,
That that's fair.
and hold up, because I am a pragmatist, I don't need to know this stuff. All I need is some explanation for how things got here. It's like, yeah, I want some backstory to start with, even if I don't know if it's completely reliable. I want to know how this, America got here, and I want some story. And if I find out that it's completely slanted and parts of it get debunked or something, I won't be surprised.
Yeah.
So that's how I look at historical knowledge. So yes, we need it. I don't write off the whole field. I'm not like a history denier. It's just I handle it in a soft way. It's like, yeah, I need a backstory for this. I need a backstory for that. But who, if it turns out to be completely slanted, it was better than no backstory. You know.
Right.
So yeah,
Okay. Yeah,
there's that.
that's yeah, not
But then it makes it hard for us to ground things like, okay, was there, who was Homer who wrote the Iliad? Who were these different figures? To me, that's not what matters. To me, the Iliad is what matters. And so a historical Jesus, that doesn't matter to me. The stories in the Bible, the resurrection, etc., that's what matters. Whether it literally happened, I say that shouldn't matter. But that's a self-made problem from Christians, in my opinion.
okay, that's fair, and I don't want to take up all your time on the existence of Jesus. I do want to talk about the pragmatism part of it a little bit, but before we get to that, what exactly? So, I mean, you don't have to, give us like a super long, nuanced kind of idea, but what would be kind of your framework of epistemology? What would you how would you go about saying that? And this isn't meant to, uh, push back on you or nothing like that. I just want to understand more, where you're coming from. It, do you have a specific epistemology you hold to, or an accumulation, or a specific justification, or truth theory, or something like that? What do you consider truth and knowledge? At least, at your personal experiential level.
Okay, so truth, knowledge, and epistemology. These are things that they have many. There are many different alternative definitions of truth, knowledge, and logic as well, and systems, etc. And so, um, upon trying to establish one over the other, we find ourselves having to defend the assumptions that they're founded on. So some of us fall into trying to reify these assumptions into brute facts, self-evident truths, or absolutes, etc.
Thank you for
But
the shout out.
yeah, but the destination is ultimately the same. They're not able to. We're not able to defend, for example, the axioms of logic, nor should we try, in my opinion. There are people who, they engage in all sorts of backbreaking acrobatics to try to do it. But I don't have to back up logic. Precepts tell me you have no grounds for intelligibility or reason. It's like, oh, well, I can't back up logic, but that's not a me problem. That's an everybody problem. But it's okay because I use logic. I can use it. I don't need to prove that its assumptions are metaphysically true. And so my point is, I I can use any of the various models of truth or epistemologies if they solve specific problems or answer certain questions. And I simply am not looking for which one is true because I consider our ideas to not have substance.
Man, um, wow, there's so many different ways I want to go. just just kind of prodding and trying to better understand. How much time did you allot for this before I just keep going and going?
I can hang around maybe for another hour. My siblings want me to play Elden Ring online later, but
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
we can keep going.
Okay, so I know some of these questions I'm going to ask you require nuance, but I would be more interested in just the simplest answer you could give as we go through them to because I'm not going to, I'm not looking to jump on to your position because I, disagree with it or whatever. I just want to know the framework. Does ontology matter to you at all?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Uh you don't have to give a specific, truth theory, but do you hold to there be would you say you line up more with I know you said, a pragmatist, but in the actual truth theory, would you line up more with correspondence, coherentist, or just pragmatism?
Um, let's see. I honestly, when considering whether something is true, I honestly don't actually consider any of those theories of truth. I just I just say something's true.
Okay,
You
that's
know.
fair. Yeah, that's no, that's totally fair. That's um and anybody that's, in the audience or may listen later. What I meant in the simplest form is, for
Let me explain
coherent
why.
truth.
Yeah, let me
What's
explain
that?
why. It's because let me explain why. Because
Oh,
um,
okay, go ahead.
I think theories of truth are nominal when they're things we've made up. And so if I'm going to make stuff up, I'd rather make it up with fewer parts. And so, I'll say something's true if I think the other person is going to know what I'm talking about, and I'll flesh it out. If someone doesn't know what I'm talking about, and if I have to use a theory of truth, then I'll probably like reach for the nearest one. So, yeah, like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. Some of these things, so I'm actually going to add this to my podcast platform. So I just some of these definitions and things that the podcast listeners may not know what I'm talking about. Uh, I and your idea of what you're talking about is true or truth. I can get on board with that. I'm not a dogmatist about really anything, especially in epistemology, because it's so controversial. All the positions. But what I meant by coherentism for those everybody else that's listening is in the simplest form. It's going to be an oversimplification, but coherentism is if it seems to line up with the web of beliefs that you already have, you kind of have like a network of beliefs that have seemed to be reliable. And what it means is, truth is that coheres. With correspondence theory would be that which corresponds with reality. That's the simplest form. That's the most. It's a very oversimplification in my experience, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Gaspar. Most people intuitively hold to correspondence theory, and I think most philosophers that I've read hold to a correspondence theory. And in pragmatism, it's more of a new theory of truth is pretty much if it so there's a variation. There's actually one that I'm more sympathetic to now, which is it kind of marries coherentism and pragmatism. If it seems to work, it's pragmatic and it coheres with a web of beliefs that seems to be pretty reliable to you, then we can call that truth. So, with that out of the way, to you, would you say, and I know this is going to be kind of like splitting the atom, but if you had to go with one or the other, uh, would you say truth is objective or truth is relative? And before you answer that, Canadian, we're not taking anybody up on stage right now. We can do it later and ask questions. We're recording this for a podcast and interview with Gaspar.
Okay, so you want to know which theory of truth I would choose?
Well, more simply, instead of even having to get into those nuances and everything, would you simply say truth is objective? And what I mean by objective is that it is the fact of the matter that this is the case, whether you agree with it or not. Or would you say it's relative in the sense that uh, something can seem to be true to me while something else can seem to be true to somebody else?
Yeah, and so you want me to tell you which one I would take?
Or you don't have to pick one or the other, but which one would you lean more towards?
Um, I have an affinity towards truth being, I don't know, relative's pretty soft. I'd say subjective, but you only gave me the options of relative. So if I have to choose, I'll say relative, but what I'm going to admit is that I think there are problems, there are ways I can be owned immediately by taking either one of these options. So,
Absolutely, and I'm not gonna jump on that opportunity because I'd rather flesh it out
well,
and give you the benefit
yeah.
of the doubt.
Well, what I want to say is, this is just me taking the options you're giving me, but like ultimately, since I think there are problems with uh, taking either one of these options, I say we bite those bullets. We not wonder which one is true. We remember that we made these definitions and we just use them. The only excuse for these ideas is that we use them, and if they reliably do what we want. So I'm not concerned with which one is actually true. So if you ask me which one I lean for, and it doesn't mean which one I think is objectively true, well, then I'll say the one that is helping me address the problems I'm trying to solve at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kinda like, a a meta pragmatist, and I just made that up, but kind of a meta pragmatist. It's while it's not necessarily just pragmatism, you would, and I'm gonna try to steel man your position, tell me if I'm wrong, but it would be case independent or case dependent. You're going to evaluate each situation instead of just giving this absolute overarching, um, you know, dogmatic view on what truth is. You're going to evaluate and make your decision based on a case by case basis.
Yeah, yeah. And furthermore, I'd say that if I thought that one of these models was intrinsically real or something, then I would be averse to the variation in the world that that model is not suitable for. And
Right.
these are
Okay.
problems that realists create for themselves, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's fair. That's I mean, I'm a realist about a lot of things, but I understand the baggage that comes with that, and it's it's something I'm still working through. So with that, um there was something I wanted to ask on that before I moved on, and my ADHD just
Let's
like
see. So you asked me
punched me
which
right in the middle of my brain.
Yeah, so you asked me if I think truth is objective or relative, which I would lean towards, and that was probably going to go somewhere.
Okay, I remember what I was gonna say. There's a reason I didn't put subjective in there,
All right.
and I may be I'm I may be on the fringe thinking this way. Uh, I've seen sentiments of it from other philosophers, but subjectivism to me is just telling me somebody's psychological state, not the epistemic state, not the there's no epistemic content there, or any kind of a possible ontology or something like that. I may be totally out of bounds on that, but when somebody says something is subjective, well, I would agree under every circumstance, because everything is, to an extent, subjective. It's up to us. It's up to the subject. We have a psychological evaluation of things, and we use the psychological evaluation to come to a conclusion, through some kind of uh, epistemic path, or to go even further, establish the epistemic path, and then a possible ontology for how that truth, or whatever it is, can exist epistemically. So I try to avoid subjectivism as much as possible. Now I'm starting to kind of reevaluate that a little bit because of the way Lance Bush, uh, and I can't go one interview without talking about Lance. I just love him. But it's because his whole different perspective of adding psychology, psychology of morality to the metaphysics, and the epistemology, that's all wrapped up into ethics, whether it's meta ethics, normative ethics, axiology, whatever it is. So that was the reason I avoided using subjectivism. So my next question would be, if, and this is just a thought exercise or a thought experiment. Don't press it too hard. I just want to kind of illuminate something, see how you deal with it, because I know you're a very, a rational and thought out person. Holding to whether it's some kind of meta pragmatic position or pragmatism or something like that. If if 100 believers in God were to come to you and say, "Well, the belief in God works for me. It fills all of these voids. It gives me explanatory scope and hypothesis, or explanatory hypothesis, with different philosophical positions. It works for us, and there's 100 of us, and there's just you. What would your response to them and their claim that God exists, because it does work for them, and works as an explanatory scope and explanatory hypothesis? What would that conversation be like from you?"
I'll give you two answers. Let's say that I don't have the fortitude to resist peer pressure, and my opinion does change on those accounts. Okay, and I do end up believing in God or thinking it's pragmatic because of those numbers. That'll lead us to my second answer, which is I don't think that that makes it objectively the case.
Right. I would, and you know what? I would actually agree with you right there. But
And what I'll say is that if if you're granting for a moment my pragmatic view, I'll just say I won't even be asking whether it's objectively true. I'll be, must be something about this Christianity. It's doing something. It's working. Maybe it's not doing what they say it's doing, but there's something happening. So, just like, I almost treat it as a certain type of evolution. You see some strange creatures that are the way they are, and my assumption is that it's been sort of refined through a long numbers game, and it's here before us for a reason. I'm not saying a magical reason. Maybe it's just like a mimetic evolution type of reason. And so that's how I look at Christianity. And so to clarify one thing, a piece of trivia, I am not an atheist who tries to deconvert theists. I'll give my honest opinion to the theists, but I don't try to flip them, and I don't hold the view that religion is this blight or boil on humanity. So I actually prefer that people, as I said at the beginning, be aware of their dispositions. Um, you don't have to try to change them. You don't have to try to be a person without dispositions. Just make sure you act intentionally, because we see cognitive biases. They are a way that our dispositions cause us to act without intention. And so um, I would say I don't want people to change their dispositions unless you want to intentionally, but just be aware of them, and from them act with intent. And I think if you act from your dispositions with intent, the results will be more wholesome than our unintentional biased actions. And so I just this kind of ties back into me suspecting that Christians are maybe not fulfilling their intentional um, engagement with Christianity because they're maybe not completely in the know that it is, well, as you wanted to reword it, literary, as literature. Some are taking it too literal, and so maybe they are not using it. It's like they're not. They've got a hammer in their hand, but they're not using it right. They're holding the hammer by the head. They're trying to nail the nail with the hammer or something. That's what I think Christians are doing with their Christianity. And so, um, yeah,
Right. Okay. So, um, I understand what you're saying there, and I would like to, address that. But before we get to that point, I'm I'm a bit confused, and more than likely, it's me, not you. So you're gonna have to talk to me like I'm 5 years old. Um, what I mean is, um, w- why did you bring up in a pragmatic scenario that after you had seemed to admit that pragmatism is what mattered to you, truth is relative in some sense, and I know I kind of forced you into an A or a B there. So feel free to kind of nuance that more if you want to. But you had agreed or seemed to say that truth is relative. It's case dependent, and it's more about the pragmatism that you're concerned about. So I'm wondering why you brought up objectively true when I brought the scenario with the Christians who said that it was pragmatic and obviously, true relative to the case that they were talking about. Would you say, given that they in fact hold truth because it's pragmatic and it's relative to their experience and their cases and seems to work in those experiences, or am I did I miss something or whatever? I mean, it just if you could, respond, nuance, whatever you got to do, because
yep,
like I said, I'm a little slow sometimes. So
no. So, um, uh, yeah. So if we took the view of pragmatism, and then we said, oh, 100 Christians, they say this, yada yada yada, and then let's say that I say, oh, well, that's convincing. I'm just saying that it may not lead where. I mean, I've heard things like this. I don't know if this is what you're using it for, but I don't know what it does to actually prove anything. It might mean that.
real quick, let me clarify something. I think you said something important there. I'm not talking in a sense of convincing people. I'm
Yeah.
just talking
Okay.
strictly in the sense of kind of what we've defined as what truth is. Would you
Yeah.
say that it is true because it's pragmatic and it's relative to their situations.
Oh, okay, okay. Now I understand. I maybe didn't understand before. So yeah, I'll say that uh, so let me explain. I'm very tolerant to alternative models. I like classical logic. I also like paraconsistent logic, which is completely contrary, you know. And so, um, and people will say, "How do you reconcile those?" And I was like, "Oh, they're only true after you've assumed their assumptions." So I'll say that Christianity can be true after you assume its assumptions. Um, however, um, since the standard is pragmatism, I'll question the functionality because the Christian or the typical Christian needs to also, for some reason, has this need to rule out all other alternative models. So it'd be fine with me. I'd let the Christian system be true because I will let systems be pragmatically true since I think truth is, arbitrary. Um, but the lack of functionality really comes where the Christian then sets out to refute all other alternative models, when in fact, all of our models are built on assumptions that ultimately we can't defend. And so taking a model um, that you like that is built on assumptions and then turning around and trying to point to other systems and say that those systems are founded on assumptions or this, that, and the other, um, that doesn't work. All right. Now, appealing to pragmatism, if you want to try to make the case that Christianity actually does what you want it to do, and that the other models do not, then that's the route I would take. But then that's a whole discussion of whether Christianity actually does what you want it to do. So does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean that small part of this conversation and topic is something we could actually have a whole conversation on. So and I'd be totally open to that in the future, but I want to be fair to you and not bog you down in, different truth theories, epistemology and things like that because I want to know more just about Gaspar and not necessarily does Gaspar have every single philosophical view worked out.
Yeah. So what I like about being a pragmatist is I don't have to have all the answers. I can be very open about what I don't know. And all I have to do is use things. I don't have to invent this working model of the universe. All I
Well,
have to do is look at what I know right now and recognize that it's not this substantive thing, but it's this utility that I need to make sure I'm getting value from or using properly, and to understand that if I think that it is true, especially exhaustively true or real, then I might be averse to the situations and phenomena where that tool or model is not working.
right. Okay, cool. So all right, I just paused the recording. If you, I just wanted to. I'm bad about having to pee in the middle of conversations and stuff like that. So I just want to give
Okay,
you a chance if you needed to go. I don't have to, but I just want to kind of give you a chance to get your breath and go piss if
I'm
you
all
have
right.
something. Okay, all right, cool. All right. So right, and I would actually, believe it or not, agree a lot with that position because, like you know, I often people who aren't familiar with philosophy, when they talk about, well, what do you do in philosophy? Blah, 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 blah. So the picture I paint for them is take a car window and crack a car window, and you're going to have thousands and thousands of little cracks and little pebbles of glass and this and that. Take one crack, just one little bitty crack out of those thousands and thousands of cracks, and a philosopher will spend their entire career on one crack. So I most definitely don't have everything worked out. So, like you, in the areas that I haven't spent a lot of time studying, reading, and thankfully, being ADHD, one of the things I can do is bounce from philosophical subject to philosophical subject. But what that does is it makes me a jack of all trades and a specialist in none. So I can tell you a little about a lot of things, but not a lot about a little things. So I rely on pragmatism. Um, that was a word that I would deny, rebuff, or try to avoid at all costs because it seems to imply, which I don't agree with, but it seems to imply as a theist that some realists' positions have to be true, and there has to be ontological or not even or in ontology some kind of metaphysical grounding. And for my Christian friends out there who hasn't spent a lot of time in philosophy, ontology and grounding or metaphysical grounding are not synonymous. Uh, so with that said, when I don't, when it's areas that I don't, what works for me or seems to be true, well, then that's what I take. So I have a sympathetic position to pragmatism in a sense because we all do. We're going to do the two worst things in the world in philosophy is, or seems to be, like cuss words, is induction and pragmatism. But the fact of the matter is, we live our life every single day thinking that we know things inductively, and we know what's going to happen tomorrow for the most part. And when tomorrow comes and everything works like we thought we knew it was going to work, well, shit, it was pragmatic. It works. Um, so, unless you wanted to say something else about that, I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit towards the more mystical part of your philosophy.
Yeah, so we're on the same page about that, what you just said, so you can move on if you want.
Rock on. Yeah. I didn't, you and I, we can spend hours talking about different philosophical positions. Um, and at the end of the day, I'm going to be right and you're going to be wrong. So we might as well just move on. What?
Yep.
So, for everybody who doesn't know, Gaspar at least holds to, and I don't want to straw man you or put words in your mouth, but would you say more of a secular philosophical approach to Buddhism?
Yeah, to a degree. Yeah.
What was it about? And I got to throw this in there, and this is going to be a low blow.
All right, let's
Um,
hear
it's totally uncalled for, but I'm going to do it anyway.
it.
It's why would you?
This is funny already for some reason.
Why would you hold to? Okay, so given your position on Jesus, Christianity, mythology, and all these things, why would you? Well, damn it, I already see a way out of it. But
It should
you
be
have
obvious.
this teacher who taught these philosophical and kind of mystical, depending on what variation. Well, let me back up a second. Would you say you're more Taoist than Buddhist?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, okay. You just kind of look at the wisdoms and writings of Taoism because I know we were talking about that. Uh, so my understanding is there's not a single writing from the Buddha until like 2000 years after the Buddha. Is it just the philosophy that appeals to you? And it doesn't matter if the Buddha existed or take that football and run it into the end zone.
Yeah, so both of those last two things. If you read what they call the Pali Canon, they're these supposed dialogues between the Buddha and his speaker and his students, but there's a lot of repetition and a lot of not exactly rhymes, but you know how old dialogues used to or poems had rhymes and that was a memorization apparatus. These texts were written in ways that had obvious amended conventions. uh, to facilitate the ability to memorize them, and there is no telling whether they are historically accurate. And I would say, in a philosophy that says that things lack substance or identity, um, the idea of there being a historical Buddha is irrelevant.
Right, fair enough. And I thought that was the position he was going to take, but I knew if I didn't ask it, I'd get all kinds of emails. Why didn't you ask him about Buddha being real and all these writings later? Um,
Yeah, yeah.
well, because I know you, I know it's more about the philosophical,
And
kind
so
of.
I want to say something to you.
Yes.
This dilemma I'm putting forward to the Christian is not, it's not this personal singling out. This is something I buy myself.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last part. What'd you say?
This is a dilemma I give to myself as well.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. So you're not one of those God hating, sin loving, special pleading kind of people.
Yeah. Yeah. So to me, what's appealing is that there's this philosophy, and to me, it's a philosophy that makes a lot of sense of other things that otherwise would be these big futile head scratchers in Western philosophy. And we can go into that. You can ask me as much about that as you want. And then there are these practices, the meditation practices that a person can do, um, and so eh, there's this sort of invitation in Buddhist philosophies, to, and this, given the philosophy itself that things lack substance, it doesn't accomplish anything to say that you are a Buddhist. It really doesn't, especially when it's a philosophy that says that the self lacks substance. So like, what does it mean to say that you are? What really matters is that you have a certain understanding of the philosophy, um, and that you do these practices. So
Right.
so to me, that was one thing appealing about it, is that it was more of an invitation. Like, look, don't take my word for it. Try these things, and see, see for yourself.
Right. So I wanted to address one thing that you said that I think is extremely important. And then after I address that, I want to do kind of just a quick rapid fire. Uh, Without giving a whole lot of nuance, I want to ask you a few questions just to see, where you land in the, this philosophy. And with that, so without confusing everybody with laying out a 5-minute agenda, I wanted to say one thing. You brought up a very good point, and that is the oral tradition of Buddhism. Uh, I like the fact that you are as consistent as you are. I like the fact that I can already see the pragmatism that you hold to bleeds straight into this philosophy because of the pragmatic nature and the benefits of meditation and introspect. And we can talk more about that in a little bit because I draw a lot of parallels between what originally prayer was in Christianity with meditation. But I want to go back and say, I love that you recognize in this oral tradition that there are what's called mnemonic devices. And for those who don't know, mnemonics is the study of memorization. And this is actually one of the points that I point out to biblical literalists and fundamentalists. If you look at, and I'm not going to address all the scripture. We don't have to go, back to Christianity and stuff like that because I'm more interested in your position. But I think you brought something up that is so important it needs to be illuminated. And the argument is that I give is if you look at the creation narrative in Genesis, and that's all I'm going to talk about, I don't care about the rest of Genesis. It is a perfect mnemonic. And what I mean by that is if you can imagine an oral culture who would pass down mythologies mixed in with histories of the people, their understanding of how the world in reality works, and you have a cursory understanding of mnemonic devices, even the fundamentalists can't deny. Um, Once it's illuminated properly and they really kind of understand the point, if you look at the 6 day creation, you can imagine the teacher, the community leader, the rabbi, whatever it is. So he'll hold up one finger and he would say, and you can even take the finger and part it into three pieces where the finger bends with the two creases in the finger. So he holds up a finger and then he goes, on this day, with all three parts, of the finger, God did this, this, and this. And then you go the next finger. On this day, God did this, this, and this. And it's a physical demonstration of a uh, kind of a trio of information that can be relayed to, the physical process of, putting the fingers up and going through the different indentions. So on the third day, God did this, this, and this. On the fourth day, God did this, this, and this. On the fifth day, God did this and this. And then you go to the other finger. And the reason being is because with the ancient Hebrew, they had a very limited vocabulary. And although gematria came about more famous later on after Hellenism, they still were very numerically driven with their language. You go to the second chapter of Genesis, and it goes through the creation story again in the very same manner. And that was the whole point of the creation narrative, and repeating the creation narrative is they are, when I say they're perfect mnemonic devices, I mean they literally fit the perfect definition of what a mnemonic device is, to have this memorization so that they can pass it on in an easy way. Jumping forward, that was the whole reason Jesus talked in parables. It wasn't necessarily to confuse everybody or be this super poet or things like that. He was trying to convey messages in a poetic way through stories where it would resonate and they could remember it and pass it on. So I think that's a lot of things, going back to like we were talking about earlier, Gaspar, with the literary devices and all that. I didn't want to jump into those nuances at that time, but since you brought that up, I kind of wanted to address that. If you want to say something on that, go ahead, and if not, I will rapid fire with a few questions to kind of hone out your position.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to object to with what you just said.
Okay, sweet. Um, Everybody heard it here. Gaspar just converted to Christianity. Um, no, it's so. Are you an idealist?
No.
Okay. Are you a dualist?
Um, nope.
Are you any kind of pantheist, panentheist, objective pantheist? It doesn't necessarily have to be a god, but maybe a collection of consciousness or something like that.
Um, no.
Okay. Um, do you believe in reincarnation?
Um, that's something I think is metaphorical, and has become superstitious. So, no.
Okay.
I have some interesting things to say about that. First of all, in a system that says that there's no inherent identity to anything, what would it mean to say that you're
Hmm.
reborn? You know, so it kind of doesn't make sense, right? And so um, I think also so if we just take it sort of as this myth that isn't literally true, there's something peculiar about it in comparison to other systems or myths about afterlife, and that is that they're saying there may be this afterlife, but they're saying it's not a good thing. That they're saying that basically any reification of phenomena such that there is perceived to be this discrete thing that isn't empty, so to speak, um, that's going to be a source of confusion, and that you don't want this to happen. And so even though conventional traditional Buddhists they believe in this reincarnation, um, which I think may is likely superstition, at least in its literal forms. Of course, there's lots of debate about like how to interpret it, but it's not really anything I pay too much attention to. But here's the thing: it's not a good thing if you're reborn. they the whole point of realizing that things are empty is so that we don't keep identifying with things that we perceive to have substance, aka so that we're not reborn. Now, again, to me, this is myth. But I think the interesting thing is that there's not this big we might live forever. We're going to be born. Traditional Buddhists say, oh, you do live forever, and that's a problem, and you need to get out of the matrix. By waking up, now as soon as you can, ASAP. And so, as a myth, that's interesting to me. It's a little bit more stoic, a little bit more, I don't know, in my opinion, and dare I say, black pill, whatever. Um, but yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Okay. Um, it's kind of
So
that's kind of
that
what I.
falls that falls on the secular end of
Right,
things.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, incidentally, I have a friend of mine who is purely secular Buddhist. So I've had, fantastic conversations with him about, the philosophy and wisdom and things that go along with it. And I think that honestly, a lot of theists would do themselves good to read, some of these mystical wisdom, of Eastern origins because it doesn't necessarily open you up to. I guess a theist it could open up to some kind of spirituality, but it gives you a way of more understanding the self and where we fit in this reality and how we deal with the self in this reality. Um, so yeah, I love I for a long time I rejected any kind of Eastern mysticism. And then the more I learned about it, it's like it doesn't have to be mystical. There are, dare I say, pragmatic reasons, to look at these different philosophical and what I call ancient wisdom. Do
yeah.
you I'm sorry, do you want to say something on that or
No, no. I was just
okay. Do you hold to karma, dharma, any of these? I know a lot of those are more with Hinduism, but I know there's a lot of the philosophy and mysticism that kind of bleeds over into, different areas of thought in Buddhism.
yeah. So uh, basically, your average New Agers and again in Hinduism, the karma is going to be like this sort of cause and effect stuff. Typically in Buddhist thought, karma is going to be the result of basically uh, the the fixation on phenomena as having a an intrinsic substance that and what follows from that. So it's like I said, I can use many different systems. I'm okay with all these different systems. But if I think they're real, suddenly my attention goes away from using them, and now I try to jealously guard them and establish them as superior to the alternatives. And then I go on this fool's errand trying to refute the alternatives while trying to show that my system is the exception and can't be refuted. So, um, so where did things go south? When we thought that something had this substance instead of being this convention, you see.
Right.
And so,
And
okay, yeah, sorry, what?
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And so what basically in Buddhism, karma more or less, and let's grant that there's debate about like everything, just like any other field, right? So I can't unilaterally answer definitively, but a lot will say that what they call karma is the result of basically the self, or the belief that there is a substantive self. You see
Right,
that?
right. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Before we got too far away from reincarnation, I did want to quote one of the greatest philosophers of the 21st century. Um, his name is Tupac Shakur,
All right.
and at 19 years old, he was in prison, and he did this prison interview. And he had already been shot once, and he'd been shot at, and all these things. And the person doing the interview said, "What do you fear most about death?" And I mean, without missing a beat, he said, "Being reincarnated and having to do this shit all over again." And I was like, you know what? That would suck. I think hell would be better than being stuck in this matrix loop of slowly but surely um, reliving life over and over until you filter out all of these um, imperfections. Is that the right word that would be used? And
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So anyway, not to get on a tangent, I thought that was like kind of one of the greatest insights ever. And anybody who doesn't know Tupac, uh, you can put your resignation to my server in my DMs. No, I'm just playing. So, so I think it goes without saying that you don't really hold to more of a realist position. I know you're not realist about anything, you're nominalist about everything, even the fact you exist. But uh there's just a quick slide in there. Do you hold
That's all right.
to higher levels of consciousness, ultimately nirvana, or do you think this is more of a philosophical, meditative kind of idea to hold to?
Okay, so um, let's see. Um, we're getting to this before I've gotten a chance to really explain what emptiness is, which might be a prerequisite for me to answer these questions.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Fire away. Oh, sorry about that. I forgot to turn my phone off.
Yeah, so uh, the philosophy of emptiness is, again, some could call it a species of a non-realist philosophy, but it's the idea. You could say it's a metaphysics, but you could also maybe say it overlaps with morality or virtue ethics, and that it's the idea that phenomena lacks inherent identity. And so, like I point out with these different systems of logic, etc. Um,
Hold on.
uh,
I'm sorry. I hate to cut in on you. When you say uh, you said phenomena, like the
I said phenomena.
phenomenological.
Yeah, I said phenomena. That's
What do you mean
appearance.
by
Like,
it lacks inherent
right?
identity? Does
Yeah.
not.
Yes. Yeah. So let me give an example. Um, let's say that uh, let's say we come up with a definition of truth that we stipulate back to the theories of truth. Okay. Um, some of us might forget that we're supposed to use truth, and we might think we need to find out what the actual truth is, or find out um, what the the truth is that our theory of truth is representing, or you know, uh, another example, I guess. Okay, I'm gonna talk about the heap paradox for the people in your audience who
Oh
maybe
my god. Do we have to go with the heap? Come on, Gaspar.
the best.
I'm just fine.
The heat
The
it's
demarcation
yeah.
problem, the yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the idea is, how many grains of sand does it take to make a heap? And then if you answer anything, the answer is why. The question's why. And then it kind of becomes, I don't know. It's kind of hard to establish what a definitive heap is, and this thought experiment is something that we could say kind of extends to most of the things that we define or coin, so to speak. Um, and also, it kind of demonstrates, depending on what your takeaway is. Maybe you're one of the people who says 500 grains of sand, but if that's not you, then I think the takeaway is, so what? I don't need to know how many grains of sand makes up a heap. And so that's what I and so now we are no longer concerned with whether the idea of a heap is a substantive idea. Okay. Um, and now we can focus on using the heap. However, if we try to look for the substance of what constitutes a heap, we won't find it. This is basically the same thing as the Theseus's ship issue that you've heard me talk about also. How many
Well,
blanks.
actually, that was the first thing that came to mind was, and the problem of identity was Theseus's ship. When does it stop being Theseus's ship?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you take one part of your car, you replace it, and it's like how many parts of your car do you replace before you're still calling it the same car? And then if you say there was a crossover point, like why did you determine that? Uh, and if you can replace the whole car, how is this idea of what the car was something other than just this label that you were given it? And so, okay, so that is sort of the idea. It's like if we replace every plank of Theseus's ship and we're still calling it Theseus's ship, well, then I guess Theseus's ship is just this label. And, um, you know, and so this doesn't matter if the ship works, in my opinion. And so this sort of leads directly to pragmatism. But the idea with that, how this ties into emptiness, is there's not this intrinsic Theseus's ship that you can stipulate. The same with the heap. There's not this intrinsic identity of the heap. Okay. And then one of our big things that we're always trying to establish in life is like exactly who we are, in various ways. And we often go through this point of discovering different parts of ourselves, and there are times where we think we discovered who we are, but I think if we pay close attention, in those moments where we just think we discovered who we are, it's more likely that we gave up a contrived idea of who we are in that moment. Um, at least when I reflect, that seems to be what it is. And so the the philosophy of emptiness is, it extends to those other objects, like, various intellectual ideas, whatever categories, but then it's advocated that this is contemplated about the self as well. It's like you know, if you look for the self, you're going to find the same thing you found with Theseus's ship, these different ideas and labels. So, um, and what's more is that if we think, w- well, okay, well, I mean, if we think one of them is real, then we might run into the same problems that we come up with when I illustrated someone being fixated to a certain model, that and taking up usages that are dysfunctional. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Absolutely.
the belief that the orientation that towards the self as being substantive is what leads to the dysfunctional and unintentional behavior of the ego, according to Buddhist thought. Because having an ego isn't just unsightly. We also see that people who are very egotistical, um, they're jerks. they hurt people, and they may be in denial that they're even doing so. And then the big insult is that they may not even be aware of what asshats they look like, you know? And then they're probably not happy about it. And so, and they have these delusions of grandeur about themselves, and they think everything's about them, and they think everybody's talking about them, and that everybody's got a conspiracy out against them. It becomes really obvious what the problem is. It's that they're self-absorbed. And the people who are on the other end of that spectrum, they don't have those problems, and they tend to, have a certain, really simple understanding of things. But they're relatable, and yeah. So without going into a long filibuster, does that? Oh, okay. So that sorry, I remember I laid this out to so that I could first answer your questions. This is not an exhaustive um explanation of emptiness. I wanted to say what it was first. It's the idea that phenomena lacks inherent identity, but then I wanted to elaborate on it with these different examples and explanations. So does that at least paint a certain picture?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Um,
And so the idea of what they call nirvana or enlightenment, that to me, I don't know if that's attainable. That might be a highly idealistic thing in the mythos, but it's at least an ideal, kind of like a straight line in geometry. Maybe we'll never find a straight line, but we use a straight line for our lines. So, what that is, uh, nirvana is supposedly the complete realization of the lack of substance of the self. That just as there's all sorts of ignorance and suffering that comes from the egotistical behavior, there is the uh, the opposing kind of insight and self-awareness that comes from someone who has more selfless qualities. Y- So does that make sense?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
And so why is this, like I said, it might be a metaphysics or um a morality, or it might be overlapping. Is that okay? So you have this idea, and this kind of is the metaphysics, is that phenomena lacks an intrinsic identity, but then the idea is that, okay, the fork in the road is, are you going to realize this or not? And these are the results of realizing it or not. And and that kind of directly leads into kind of examining the qualities of selflessness versus egotism. Do you see what I
yes,
mean?
yes, absolutely. And I did want to make a clarification there. I said the demarcation problem, which it kind of is a demarcation problem, but it's typically referred to as the gap problem. Um, when does a hill become a hill? At what point of walking up the rise are you no longer on the plane or the rise and you're actually on the hill?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I I totally and just kind of a side view, I think that's why some type of dualism is necessary. You know, um, it doesn't have to imply, you know, theism. Some type of it could be, like this. One could be. I'm actually kind of a minimal idealist. I think at the fundamental layer of reality is the mental. And I think pretty much all theists who hold to any kind of idea of divine conceptualism, any type of, ontology for quote unquote universals or abstracts that exist objectively. I know you're a nominalist, you wouldn't even go that route. Uh, that you have to be ide- an idealist, at least at the fundamental layer of reality. So those things aren't necessarily issues for me. The gap problem, I think, is it kind of, and you might disagree with this, but it kind of reminds me of like the trolley problem, in ethics or meta ethics. It's there's, I mean, 100 different people are probably going to answer it 100 different ways. But the point of the matter is, there is a point that we only have a few grains of sand. And there is a point that pretty much everybody's going to identify it as a heap of sand. Now, in between that, it doesn't mean it has to be, you know, dogmatically, objectively true that, you know, 6,231 grains of sand makes a heap. I think at some point, whether it's really objective or not, who's going to argue over when there's a heap and when there's not? Um, I think these are, and even though I'm a student of philosophy and I love philosophy, I think these are some of the thought experiments that get us so bogged down in trivial, nuanced, if you will, what is the word I'm looking for, Gaspar? The pedantic positions, because I tend to agree, a bit with you. At some point, some things are just pragmatic. Who gives a shit? Uh, if it works at some point, at time T, it's not a heap, but at time T1, there's a lot of sand there, and we need to refer to it as more than just a few grains of sand. It's a fucking heap. I mean, that's just, that's kind of how I feel about it. Are you live? You're not lighting up. Hmm.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear
All right.
me? Can
Okay.
you
I'm back.
hear me? We can't hear you, Gaspar.
So, um, uh, yes. I mean, I don't have any objection to what you said. I guess really I'll just give some clarification. Uh,
Wait a minute. What'd you say about what I
a person
said?
could say that,
What'd you say about what I said?
yeah, I think I agree.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought I wasn't sure what you had said. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Um, uh, so, um, yeah, so about pragmatism and why is it not this unrelated appendage? So, um, back to sort of the philosophy of emptiness. I mean, if a person looked past some of the labeling or the branding, they could say that this philosophy of emptiness, maybe was an earlier case of pragmatism, because if the philosophy is that phenomena lacks intrinsic identity, and that you know either if you realize this, you're going to understand that phenomena versus you misunderstanding it and misusing it. If you don't know this, then immediately we need an excuse to keep talking about different things. We need an excuse to say that I need to realize this. How absurd is it to say that there's an I who needs to realize that the self lacks substance? So they called this conventional knowledge, um, versus actual knowledge. Um, and it was that, okay, so the actual knowledge is that phenomena lacks this substance, but then we have to articulate, we have to use useful fictions, um, despite this. But we can use these useful fictions with the knowledge that they are useful fictions, aka with the knowledge that they lack substance. You see, and
Right.
so um, this is this use of conventional knowledge is built in to the system of the philosophy of emptiness.
It just sounds so oh, it sounds so nihilistic. talking about a philosophy of emptiness. Um, but without getting, we're coming up on 2 hours. Without getting bogged down in that, I did want to cover before we went um, meditation. Meditation is something that I find extremely beneficial, extremely pragmatic for the 5,000th time. And if there ever was anything that we could experience phenomenologically as spiritual, I think that proper meditation, and what I mean by that is without um, interruption, uh, deep, long, breathing exercises, um, closing out the world behind us, and uh, really spending time trying to understand or realize or feel, if you will, the inner us or whatever it is, the because like I've told people, like we talked about earlier with like or it may have been in the general chat about uh spiritual experiences. And I'm not one who talks about spiritual experiences because nobody knows my essence, what I experience, my qualia, my what it is like to be me. And God knows I have done a lot of drugs in my life, and nothing with drugs. Just about every kind of, psychedelic, hallucinogenic, whatever you want to call it. I have experienced euphoria and, things like that. But the two, I say two because those are the two that stand out the most to me. And I can recite them, almost detail for detail, minute by minute. They were unprovoked. I wasn't looking for, any kind of connection with God. I wasn't necessarily thinking about God or anything like that. It was just like perfect time, perfect weather, perfect circumstances, and having this unbelievable warmth, peace, and calm come over me. And the crazy thing about it is not necessarily the feeling that I mean, literally a physical feeling that I've never experienced before. But the fact that even though I wasn't like meditating on God, concentrating on God, or necessarily even thinking about God, I was literally enjoying a breeze with the sun on my face in the middle of a field. Um, I just kind of enjoying the moment. And what was striking to me was the second I became overwhelmed with this warmth, this joy, this peace, uh this happiness, and I just can't explain. I mean, smiling with tears coming out of my eyes, and anybody who knows me intimately, uh I was a toxic uber male. If there was toxic masculinity, that was me because that was the environment I grew up in. But what caught me and what really set me aside is for some reason I immediately knew it was God. I wasn't thinking about God. I wasn't provoking this. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't praying. I was literally enjoying a breeze and the sun on my face. But there was this sudden, overwhelming experience. And I just knew with every bit of certainty that I exist, that this was God. Uh, whatever you want to call God. It was something not of our physical reality. I didn't speak in tongues and like heal people and make gold come out of my ass or anything like that. It was just this phenomenal, emotional, unprovoked response that I had. Now, I've done deep meditation because I think that meditation is extremely healthy mentally and physically. And I've never ever now I've had some pretty awesome meditative moments, but nothing ever like that. Not even close. Nothing even close to the experiences I had on drugs. I know the human mind is phenomenal and has these awesome abilities, and there's so much we don't know about it. And it totally possibly could have been something biological. I don't know that, but being confident in the idea that a God exists and it's a personal God, it fits perfectly well within that paradigm. But that's where I leave it. I leave it within that paradigm. So sorry for going off on a tangent about that, but do you practice meditation? When you meditate, what is it like to you? And have you ever had like a what you would call a spiritual experience meditating?
All right. So, um, let's say I meditate approximately maybe an hour to 2 hours a day. And okay, so the philosophy of emptiness is about not reifying phenomena. Um, there is a, I'm sorry, I'm hearing myself repeating myself back through you, Eddie. I'm sorry.
Oh, let me mute. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, and there's a Buddhist proverb, and it's if you see the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha. And the idea is, okay, maybe you haven't had certain things happen while meditating. Um, and first of all, meditation is a big catch-all term. There's a lot of things people do. Some people just sit down, but there are some other sophisticated forms of it, and things can happen that other people might think are spiritual beings talking to them. But given the philosophy of emptiness, the fact that things lack substance, it's advocated that if you have, you know, some kind of visions or hallucinations or whatever, that you not think that they are real. And that's more or less kind of along the lines of what it means to kill the Buddha if you see it on the road, because what you're trying to accomplish is not to see some interesting, entertaining thing. It is to realize that this self that you identify through um, lacks substance. And it is also advocated that people don't overly conceptualize these experiences when they've happened um, by talking about them too much. So one thing I think about Christians is, they have something happen, and often it's transformative in a good way, and then they develop these opinions about it, and then they talk about it too much, in my opinion. And so through meditation, I have had things happen to me that other people would call spiritual experiences, but I do not treat them as such. I consider it to be the sudden shift in your perception that comes from suddenly seeing through maybe a certain aspect of the ego that has you've been carrying around with you your whole life. It might seem like you're suddenly in a different world, but that's not what it is. It's not something transcendent. It's that suddenly you stop believing in some tooth fairy, so stuff's a little weird for a second. But then the result of that is that you have a better understanding of yourself and maybe other people as well, and you exhibit less of these egotistical tendencies that people that we talk about, like with extreme cases like narcissists, like maybe Trump and some other figures. So um, uh, I have had these things happen, but I would not call them what you call them. I would not draw the same conclusions that you draw from them. But I'll ask you this: from the pragmatic standpoint, you would say that in your experience, well, let me ask you instead of assuming, did it have a positive effect on your behavior, like a wholesome effect, a lasting effect on your behavior thereafter? Or was it a one time thing? You there?
It yeah, it is no, it happened to me a couple times. And um the first time I remember a lot of the details, but I can't honestly and transparently say there
Yeah, I'm
wasn't
sorry,
some
but
kind.
yeah, but what I really want to know is like, did it have a lasting effect on your behavior
Oh,
and your state of mind?
oh, absolutely. The second time, the one that I remember, second by second, minute by minute, moment by moment, as well as I can relive that, um, it had a profound impact on my understanding of Christianity, theism, um, and the existence of quote unquote what I usually say something other.
Okay. So, and I believe you. I believe these things happen to people, and it's just so painfully hard to talk about. And an example I like to point to um, is, before someone has had their first relationship, um, all the lyrics of love songs, so to speak, they just don't make any sense. And I remember before I had my first relationship, I thought it was pretentious bullshit, love songs, because they talk about some weird things that don't make any sense, all these weird feelings. But then after you've had your first relationship, maybe your first breakup, suddenly it all makes sense, right? And so certain things and certain mythologies can start to make sense once a person has maybe had something happen like what has happened to you. Um, and like what I'm saying has happened to me, although I won't draw the same conclusions from them, like, oh, there's this other side of, there's this transcendent reality, because to me, that is straying from the idea that phenomena lack substance, and we're starting to engage in reification and objectification of things, and so we're getting back up into that kind of egotistical behavior there, where we want to cling to shiny objects like Gollum. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally get what you're saying. So
And and let me say this: if the conclusions you draw from those things um, aren't right, I would say it doesn't matter if it's had the effect on someone's behavior that you're saying it does. And I take your word for it, because I've had something happen to me, a shift in perspective that was almost like, taking off a pair of sunglasses that you've been wearing your whole life. Suddenly seeing it's the same world, just different. But what I like about the philosophy um, uh, of emptiness is we are not under any pressure to say that this is some transcendent meaning. This is just what it this is the real result of, for a moment seeing through the self. And so uh it's basically just going from delusion to less delusion. So that's less glamorous than spiritual, but um it's paramount, right? Especially if the main problem with humans is their egos. So that's how I look at it. And so I wouldn't reify it into saying that it is a spiritual experience, although I suspect it's the same thing that happens to many people of many different cultures, and even some people who have no religion. They have sometimes this spark happens in their mind, and they have a perspective shift, uh, and it's so hard to talk about, you know. But then they change in noticeable ways, and so some people say you shouldn't talk about it. If you really want to share that with other people, then you have to embody the values that came from that. So like the ways that it changed your behavior and things like that. Um, you know, in the Buddhist tradition, they would say, don't talk at length about your experiences, but from those experiences come a certain natural, uncontrived compassion, and that's what you give to people if you want to help open their minds and help shed people's biases. You see,
Right.
So-
Right. Um, well
so it's
explained.
arranged different. It's it's
Yeah.
it's it's like arranged differently. But so this, yeah. So I don't want to ramble, but that's what I think about
I was
that.
gonna
And so
say,
my
if you go too much further, you're gonna lose me because I get it right now. But
okay, all right, yeah.
that's just me. Anybody who wants him to keep going, you can DM me and I'll dump it in
No,
the
no, 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 no.
trash box.
I'm gonna let you go on to the next question.
That's no, yeah, I think I mean, you and I have had, a lot of conversations, deep conversations, and some kind of you may not remember. I think a few of them you had quite a bit to drink, but we we had some great conversations. So I feel like I came into this at least 25 to 35% understanding where you were coming from. So that extra little bit of, 25 to 30% kind of gets me over there. I'm getting further away from thinking that you're a Fruit Loop and more. I'll just play. I love you. So let's do this, Gaspar. Since we're over 2 hours, I want to do round two of kind of a rapid fire questions. Now, obviously, um, everything that you give to this is going to be oversimplified and it will not be held against you in court. Um, but if you feel like it's something you need to nuance, go ahead. Um, what do you think about drug induced spiritual moments such as psilocybin, where there have been and even I think it's peyote and a few others that have had a phenomenal amount of positive, life changing experiences under, and this is for all of my audience and everybody that's listening, under controlled laboratory eh, experiences with professionals giving it to them. Go ahead, Gaspar.
Um. So I guess I will give two answers. First, I- I've I'm not an expert on this, but I've done a little bit of research on it. I've watched some interesting documentaries, and I don't find anything about it to be unbelievable. Um, it sounds like I watched a documentary. I think it was called "Fantastic Fungi" or something. This guy takes psilocybin, and before that he had a stutter, and then his stutter just permanently went away. All right, I believe that. I've heard of people just quitting their addictions. Um, and then the second answer is I'd question any metaphysical conclusions drawn from that.
And I actually would agree with you on that. Um, I think it's something. I'm one of the few theists who actually endorse methodological naturalism in the sciences. Um, I don't like the, you know, um, the reductionist that's kind of like a fundamentalist reductionist or like an ultimate reductionist. Everything reduces down to biology and things like that. I think that there's plenty of room in the philosophy of mind and everything else to talk about emergent properties or some kind of property dualism. You don't even have to go all the way to substance dualism. There's all kinds of ways we can explain that without having to go to this you know almost what I would consider like a fallacious reductionist view. Um, so with that, I think that given the, the small amount of consciousness, I mean, we can't even define consciousness. You take 50 people and line them up and you ask them what consciousness is. You can take 50 experts and line them up and ask them what consciousness is. What qualifies as self-awareness? Well, the weakest test is the self-awareness test where they look in the mirror and they recognize themselves. That's about as far as we can go with it. We can draw correlations with neuroscience, brain mapping, activity in the brain of different neurotransmitters and neural pathways, but we can't explain neuroplasticity. We can explain cognitive behavioral therapy, where your thought pattern actually changes the physical structure of your brain. Um, there's so many things about the human mind. Uh, Even if some kind of monism is true or monism is true, and it is some kind of emergent property from the brain, that in itself, uh, dare I say, would be some kind of miracle. And I don't mean that in a theistic, way. It's, getting this carbon based life, this materialistic non-animate, they're inanimate objects, literally, um molecules and atoms and all of these different elements that are used to construct life from quote unquote chance. And I won't even get into that word because the whole how chance can have causal power, that really just that boggles my mind. Anyway, I digress. How do we get from rocks, dust, dirt, molecules, all these different things, non-animate, non-moral agents, to a species? Never mind the fact that species like us, but even anything biological. We look at the complexity of DNA and RNA, and we have the chicken and the egg problem. Was it RNA first? Was it DNA first? How does RNA, come together without the protective coating like DNA has? How does it just come together from some soup? Why, or all of life has, and I'm not opposed at all to getting some kind of working, theory of abiogenesis, evolution. We could have a theory from one to the other. I don't think it implies theism or negates theism. But one of the most intriguing factors there is all of what we consider life has. Sometimes I get this confused, so I may be wrong. Somebody can correct me, but it's left-handed amino acids. Everything without life has right-handed amino acids, and right-handed amino acids, the branch chain amino acids, are plentiful throughout everything that we know. But it just so happens we have to have left-handed amino acids in order to have what we quote unquote call life. So when I look at all these things, even if I wasn't a theist, I'm thinking, some kind of Bernardo Kastrup's objective uh, pantheism, like a naturalistic pantheism. I'm thinking of there's got to be at least consciousness fundamental, or there has to be something. We don't even have to call it a god, but something that exists, even either as a composite of the whole of reality that kind of gave rise to this, or it's pure chance, materialism, reductivism that has so many philosophical problems. So when you look at these, like, the problem of free will, a lot of people say, oh, free will is just illusory, or it's not real and all that. There's a reason they call it a problem of free will. We have an intuition that we seem to be able to control our behaviors. Regardless if we truly can or not is a different topic. But it seems though we can. We have the problem of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. How does this seemingly immaterial, abstract, or emergent property interact with the physical? We have the identity problem, the Theseus's ship you were talking about. What is it about the human? Is there anything there given cell replication in so many years? I'm not the same person I was biologically, 10 years ago. So if I knock off, the local liquor store, because I want to go buy some crack or, hook up with Gaspar and get some hose or something like that. Uh, that's not me now. So if the legal process took until now to get here, oh, I'm literally not biologically the same person. So how do we keep identity over time if there's not something immaterial? How do you, Gaspar, answer all of these quote unquote philosophical problems? And here's the caveat and the catch to it. You can't dismiss them and say they're not problems. I know you're a nominalist. I know you for fairness. Um, I know you probably would go to some type of, like we've been talking about, pragmatism or something like that, and you defend that position well. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with your position, but I want to know, when that's off the table, how does Gaspar defend his position without saying, I just don't care about them, or it's just not pragmatic, given the way that you live your life every day and how you view existence in the human experience itself?
All right. So real quick, can you just clarify? Sorry, that ended up that had a lot of stuff. So can you real quick just what questions you want me to answer?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I kind of get into interviewer, want to be super deep, great, guy with all these great questions and things, and I get tangential. Or is it tangential? Is that the
Yeah, I
right
think
word?
that's right. No,
Okay.
all right.
Oh, I love you, Gaspar. So, um, how does Gaspar approach the hard problem of consciousness? How does Gaspar approach the identity problem? How we obtain identity over time? Um, how does Gaspar approach um, at least the illusion of free will? Um, how do you approach what all of these things that are considered philosophical problems without appealing to nominalism, pragmatism, or just not caring? How would you approach it? And if those are your positions, it's totally fair to say I'm going outside of my position just to answer it on your terms. But how would you approach that if those were off the table?
Let's see. Okay. Um, if you take away pragmatism, okay. So if you take away pragmatism, you took away something like say the philosophy of emptiness that I've talked about. My default go-to would be solipsism. And that was kind of my only real thing I believed before I discovered this philosophy. And so it's the idea that I don't know anything other than my mind, and so I, all I know is that I exist. That's the degree of skepticism I would prefer. But I don't think that skepticism goes far enough because, and I guess this gets to the identity. Well, I'm going to knock it out first, one by one. So if we go back to solipsism and we say, okay, this world could be a dream, but at least I know I exist. That perspective. Oh, and they call this, right, the problem of solipsism. It's like a problem for all other views because, it's hard to establish anything else, but this is the view you can arrive at if you doubt everything and clean the slate. So from the solipsistic perspective, the hard problem is, well, you said I can't say it's not a problem, but there's a point where I'd have to start telling you beliefs that don't hold. Yeah, but
That's
it,
fair. That's I was just I know your I
I'm
mean
trying to explain it in words that aren't repetitive because I think that's what you're trying to avoid.
yeah, it's and I understand your position is, pragmatism, nominalism, screw all the isms. Let's, look at life and see how things fit into this box and experience a life and what we can make of it.
Yeah.
Uh,
So let me finish. Let me finish
I'm
trying to
sorry.
do
Yeah,
what I.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's all
Okay.
right. So there's the issue of, so from the solipsistic perspective, that this world, all I can know is my mind, or and I'm dreaming it up. Then part of the dream is the material world, and so the hard problem is not a problem there. You see, um, and I know that that doesn't satisfy what you said, but like, I don't want to get into actually trying to make up ideas that like are not positions I hold. So I tried to avoid saying, "Oh yeah, uh, different philosophies of mind are useful in different cases." And I decided to paint this picture here because it shows that the the hard problem is only a problem when you assume materialism. In my opinion, is not a problem for the solipsist. And then the second one is the identity problem. The identity problem is why I'm not a solipsist. If we engage in all that doubt and say, "Oh, look, I don't want to make any assumptions. All I can know is that, I exist." It's like, well, that's half-assed skepticism because you left that one stone unturned, and that's the you that you're saying exists. So why don't we why don't we investigate what that is and see if it's exempt to this heap problem or the ship problem. Um, and so it's kind of like the completion of solipsism is what you could say emptiness is, because the solipsist says, oh, well, all of phenomena is something in in my mind, and all I know to exist is myself. But then if you go further and say, okay, well, who is this self? You just come up with other heaps of sand, basically. Other, oh, am I my memories? Oh, am I my thoughts? Oh, who knows? Those are changing all the time. So who the heck am I? It's basically back to Theseus's ship. And so um, then you realize, okay, so the different identities I conceive of, those are part of the appearances, and the self that I think exists, I may not be able to establish it. So I may not be able to. Well, it's the one thing that I thought existed, so I may not be able to establish substance of this world. So in one way, you could arrive at this philosophy that I'm pointing to by removing everything, including the solipsistic self. And so you could say the solipsism isn't skeptical enough. And because it's only a half-assed skeptical endeavor, it ends up being as dysfunctional as we know solipsism to be. But emptiness is more functional than solipsism for the reasons that I've stated earlier. Now, the other question, and so I've at least given you some answer to those two questions without talking about pragmatism. And then the third question you brought up, which was, what was the third question? Eddie?
Um, uh, shit, I don't know. Um,
Anyone in the audience remember what the third question is? Sorry, it slipped my mind.
it's okay. It slipped mine too. I think. Well, I kind of put you in a hard position, to try to. I after listening to you, try to explain these positions, from a perspective that you don't hold yourself. Um, I kind of
Well, I
realize
give you
that.
another. I didn't make any. I didn't make anything up. I told you things that I actually think. I just
Right.
used different words. So,
Yeah. Well, I
those are
just want
things that
to
I
say,
think like.
I think it was a bit unfair. Um,
No, it's okay.
but
I mean, yeah.
yeah, I was trying to get, I guess how you would approach it, outside of nominalism or pragmatism or something like that. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, and I know that is your position, you've defended it well, and we've had many a conversation. So I think that that part was probably a little bit unfair on my end. I just wanted to see kind of how you would come at it
Okay.
if, yeah, if that wasn't your position. But I must say this, okay? When you said material world, it made me think of our next unofficial, damn, I can't even talk, unofficial sponsor. So hang tight for 1 second. Is my age showing? Uh, so this is we're going on 2 hours and 30 minutes. So this is the hardest part, and we're gonna wrap it up. Okay, you ready for it?
Yep.
Okay, I thought maybe you went and got a dab or something. Um, this is your task. I've spent all of this time asking you questions and your perspective, and how you come at it, and all of this. And one, um, I didn't expect uh, anything less than a stand up guy who would come in here and defend his views, even though, at least in Discord and, all these little social areas, they're not the most popular views. So first of all, I wanted to commend you for undergoing the interview and just taking question after question after question. I think you did a fantastic job of defending your positions. Um, I think at least people can walk away
All
from
right.
this and
Thanks.
say, yeah, I think people could at least walk away from this and say, if nothing else, he's consistent and he's really thought out his position. So here's the hard one: ask me anything you want for as long as you want, because you have been cross examined this whole time. And I love you and dig the shit out of you for doing it. So anything you have, whatever, fire away however long you want.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. All right. So, um, you talked about your experience, and I understand that to maybe some people, stories like that are a little bit odd. So I liked. That's why I highlighted and asked you, has it had a positive effect on your behavior? And focus on the pragmatic aspect of it. So, um, due to the perspective shift that you had from your experience, would all the if you found out that, I mean, how many dogmas of Christianity or interpretations would it take to, let's say that, one by one you found out that they were false? How many would it take for you to for that experience to be invalidated?
Excellent question. Um, I I truly feel like I am an evidentialist, and when I evaluate, so just for a little bit of perspective, when somebody talks about, just grant, for the sake of argument, Jesus was a real person. The biblical Jesus existed, not necessarily everything that he did is what happened. It was Yehoshua, he was charismatic, he was apocalyptic preacher, all this stuff. When I evaluate the um, different positions, let's say the inference to the best explanation, and that was actually one I wanted to ask you about earlier about your position on inference to the best explanation. But we're going to save that as a teaser for part two. Um, when I look at inference to the best explanation, when I look at Bayesian uh, probabilities, given at least what we would at least consider soft facts, the prior probability, background knowledge, all these things. If somebody approaches the resurrection hypothesis with the epistemological position that in history we can deduce more than likely what happened, or at least get really close to an idea of the people existing, who they are, and how it happened. I think if somebody takes naturalism or theism and they set them all aside, forget about a God existing, forget about only the natural world exists, forget about all of that. We're leaving all logical possible explanations on the table. There is not a single hypothesis that explains all the facts of the resurrection. So it has that hypothesis has the explanatory scope and the explanatory power. Now, I want to caveat that with, even if we approach it from an objective measure, no theism, no atheism, no naturalism, we just, in a vacuum, we look at everything that's there without the background knowledge of natural theology, having some kind of at least leaning towards a God existing. I don't expect a naturalist, an atheist, or people who are skeptical of non empirical claims, or a lot of atheists will say, yeah, it's possible God exists. But there's a lot of them that really don't think it's possible. And when I say it's possible God exists, what I mean is it's at least logically possible. So even if we assign a very low probability to God existing, it's a possibility that if this entity exists, whatever he is, whatever, we put that into our prior probability, or not even prior probability. We can start off like the McGrews and go way down with our prior probabilities, but it's part of the background knowledge. And with that background knowledge, um, and the explanatory scope of the hypothesis, I don't think one can deny that that is the best explanatory hypothesis given everything that we know about it. But I don't expect a naturalist, an atheist, non-Christian, or something like that, even though that's the best hypothesis and explanatory scope. If, and I hate this word supernatural because I don't even know what supernatural and natural really mean. They're very ambiguous. If one gives the possibility of the supernatural, and there's even a low probability that some kind of God or something like that exists, I think one has to confront at least what we think we know about the life of Christ, his teachings, his death, and alleged resurrection, that the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation for what happened, given all things are equal. Now, let me caveat that with, I grew up as a young child thinking Jesus was a real person, Jesus was God, and God exists. I spent many years in poverty, very rough childhood, went through a lot of terrible experiences. So most of that time I was an apatheist. If somebody asked me, I would say, "Yeah, yeah, God, yeah, I'm a Christian." Even though I didn't know what that meant, I couldn't tell you, aside from the token, Romans 3:23, I think it is, for all of sin and come short of the glory of God. All the little fundamentalist scriptures and stuff. Uh, and I went through, as I said earlier, um, and I'm sorry for carrying on. I just feel like there's a little bit of nuance that's needed here. Um, a deconstruction because I was a young Earth creationist only by default. I just accepted these things as true. I didn't investigate them myself. And I was a biblical literalist. I was an inerrantist. If you don't take scripture for its clear, plain, face value meaning, then you can't trust any of scripture. Uh, God doesn't make mistakes. This word was preserved throughout history, time, and blah, 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 blah for reproof and correction, as Paul says. And then Paul says the scriptures God breathed, and they make this logical leap to, this dictation method of literalism or inerrancy. I went through a deconstruction from that because of my venture into science, and I loved science. And the more I studied about evolution and the evolution of cosmology, the Big Bang Theory, all these different things, it just it didn't comport with um this idea that was kind of pounded into me by proxy. They didn't tell us you can only think of the world black and white. There's no gray area. They didn't tell us that I couldn't question the pastor. They never said that, but they presented it in a way that if I'm questioning the King James version or the way the pastor's teaching it to me, I'm questioning God's word. And if I'm questioning God's word, I'm questioning God. And who am I to question God? And this is literally the way that they presented it. That's how they get this closed mindedness and this black and whiteness that a lot of fundamentalists go through. Worse than that, they'll go to the book of Revelation and talk about the three or the seven churches, I think it is, and it goes through the hot church, the cold church, and the lukewarm church. And the lukewarm church was always the spiritually lukewarm because they have no idea of the geography there and actually what Jesus meant by that. So they literally teach you that being a liberal Christian is worse than being an unbeliever. This is the shit that's like, pounded into your head. It's like either you're on fire for God or you're cold and you're an unbeliever, or you're a lukewarm Christian, which is the worst because Jesus detested that. And he said he would spit them out of his mouth. And this twisted ass doctrine. So all this shit come tumbling down when somebody asked me if the guy was an old earth creationist, had different eschatology views, all these different things. And he said, let me ask you one question. If evolution was true or old earth creationism was true, does that affect who Jesus is or what he did? And as I thought about it, I was like, well, I guess not. And then he says, if old earth creationism and evolution is true, um, does it affect the trustworthiness or the veracity of scripture? And I said, yeah, because scripture plainly reveals in the most plain sense possible, which is how we should accept it. Uh, the world was created in 6 days, blah, 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 and all this. I said, if we can't trust that, we can't trust any of Scripture. And he said, you just committed a fallacy. I said, what do you mean? I didn't even know what a fallacy was at that time. He said, that's called the slippery slope fallacy or throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because it's not literally face value true to the way that you approach it doesn't mean it's not trustworthy. And then he clarified it and said, does it affect what Scripture says or does it affect how you interpret Scripture? And the more I thought about it, I was like, well, I guess it's more the approach because I could be wrong about the approach. And then the last thing he said was, um, oh, what was it? Damn it, I'm drawing a blank now. The Scripture, young Earth creationism, all these things. Anyway, that kind it'll come to me in a minute. So that kind of got my wheels turning, and things like that. Oh, this is what I was going to say. He said, if the world was only 6 to 10,000 years old, how is it possible that we could experience, I think it was a 1985 or 86 supernova A? It was over 600,000 light years away, which means it took 600,000 years at the speed of light to reach Earth. So when we witnessed this event, we were witnessing something that happened 600,000 years ago, which destroys the 6 to 10,000 year, uh, idea of young Earth creationists. And I said, well, I mean, well, of course, God can make it with the appearance of age. And then he responded with, well, then you're in all kinds of conundrums. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, first, Scripture says to look to the heavens that declare the majesty of God in his handiwork. And it talks over and over about looking at creation around us and seeing the majesty of God. So if we do an honest investigation into the creation around us, and it appears to us that everything is old, but it's really not, then God is, at best a deceiver. And I was, so I was like, I don't know if he's a deceiver. He said, okay, well, then how about this? Have you ever heard of last Thursdayism? I said, no. He said, if God can, if God can create everything with the appearance of age, never mind the fact that it's not old, it just looks old. And we're supposed to look at it to see where we stand. Um, Forget the whole part about him possibly being deceiving. How do you know we weren't all created and the world created in the way that it was last Thursday with all the memories, experiences, and everything implemented by God, put there? I was like, that's ridiculous. And he was like, well, okay, well, then prove to me, under your view, that it didn't happen last Thursday. And so, I went through all kinds of mental gymnastics and everything. And from there, the entire worldview, paradigm, heuristic, everything that I viewed the world through literally came tumbling down. I mean, everything. It was one of the most scariest points in my life. I thought I had at least half of life figured out with the existence of God, Jesus, is all of these different things. And I went through a significant spiritual, deep kind of depression. I wasn't in a clinical depression. I did end up going through that later. But I was in this, this kind of nihilistic, unhopeful kind of phase because everything I thought was true, real, or at least could be defended was gone. It was no longer a mass of a heap of sand. It was literally sand crumbled on the floor. So I had to kind of rebuild my metaphysics and worldview from the position that I was at. And one thing I can tell you, Gaspar, and I'm sorry I went so far off on a tangent. I just think that all of this is important to kind of drawing out the point. I never ever, no matter how much I doubted, no matter how scared I was, no matter how unsure I was, I could not get away from the intuition that something other than the reality we experience every day and all of this existed. No matter how much I was unsure about everything, I just seemed to keep the intuition that something like a God existed. Now, I know that could have been the priming growing up. I know that could have been going, Sunday school and all this shit growing up and the environment and all of that. But at the end of the day, even though I know all of that could have had an effect on what my intuition is, I cannot deny what seems to be true to me. And that was the problem I was in, uh, which even got worse later on in life. But I just could not get to the point where I thought the natural world, natural forces, chance, randomness, all these things was reality. No matter how hard, no matter how much physics I studied, quantum mechanics, all of that, none of it would tip me over the edge. And I had no emotional attachment to it. Because if God existed, I had no idea who this God was. It didn't benefit me one bit to think that a God existed, at that time, because I was unsure about anything and everything. And it was just an intuition that no matter how long my epistemic journey was into philosophy of religion, I fell into apologetics for a while. I hate apologetics. I loathe it. I got the hell out of it. Um, and I just have never found something that rises to the level of an undercutting defeater or a rebutting defeater that would cause me to take a counterintuitive position. And that's why, um, at least in the first part of my life for many years, is why I held to theism being true.
I see. Can you hear me? Blah blah
Yes.
blah. Okay. Um. All right. Yeah. That I think that answers the question. I guess the option I was going to give you is that based on that experience that you told us about and its positive effects that it had on your life and your behavior, I would say it shouldn't matter which ideas end up not being true. And I would probably say there shouldn't be an idea that would make you uh, question that experience. However, I would say drawing conclusions from whatever happened or labeling it at length, I think is already starting to reify it. So that is where our differences are going to be. And so, you talked about different philosophies of mind, etc. You know, and you talked about the different definitions of consciousness and how how hard it is to come up with one. And I would say that's just the situation. It is yet another heap. We cannot we can come up with useful definitions for consciousness, but we can't really describe it in terms of the senses. So that's okay with me. Consciousness is just another thing that lacks substance. Opinion, we can just call it consciousness. Um, and and so what I'm saying is, if I tried to reify at length consciousness by trying to pinpoint what it was, or so I would, and so I'll say, I guess it's kind of like, when you have a really good experience of any kind and you talk too much about it, you might affect your own understanding of it and your own memory of it. And so that's why I think when people have things like what you described, it's probably best not to f- frame it, because then we can be left with a contrivance. Although I'm not saying that's what happened. It's just I asked that question because I wanted to hear your answer, and I wanted to give you the option to the option that um, refute it, in my opinion.
The option that what?
Yeah, being debunked should end up refuting that.
Debunked. DEBOON.
Said which Christian?
Was that?
Yeah, well, yeah. So was that a satisfactory beat beat down? I feel pretty beat down.
Well, you know what? It wasn't a satisfactory beatdown. Well, it's not satisfactory for two reasons. One, um, I expected you to come fully loaded and ready to defend all positions. And two, um, we've had enough discussions. Uh, and I'm pretty sure you've been at this at least as long as I have. And so I knew, you know, not that it's a game of who can answer the most questions, kind of thing. But, you and I have been at it long enough, even though you're a lot younger than me and probably could be my son. Um, it's I I know from our conversations you've thought about it enough that you would have a pretty good defense for it. So, um, anybody who is here for a literal beatdown, um, you got taken for clickbait. But I knew it'd be a great conversation. Although we disagree fundamentally on a lot of things, I think, and I and I hate to, talk about myself in a humble fashion, but I think between us both, I think we have enough intellectual humility and uh, charitability that it's not possible for you and I, to have a bad conversation about any of this unless you had too much to drink, and then I would have to kick your ass out of my server.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, okay, so let's sum this all up. At the end of the day, my position is predicated and rested upon the fact of actual historical figures with a possibility of, if they're related to God in some kind of fashion and a God exists, they're totally plausible. And yours are like woo, magic, and mysticism. And you have no epistemic or ontological basis to hold to your position when you should just admit you hate God and you love sinning. You're just not one of the elect and you're pissed off at that. And I think that's where it all ends.
I would say have a little respect for magic and mysticism.
I tried so hard to keep it together. I just at the end of it, I couldn't even. Oh, I couldn't even keep it together anymore. Gaspar, I love you, bro, man. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah.
Uh, we've had great conversations before, but I think this is the
Yeah.
first time I've got, a good, kind of unlimited amount of time to let you kind of lay a lot of things out and nuance. And I know there's quite a few things there, with the rapid questions and stuff like that 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 have a lot more nuance to it. So, I won't hold your feet to the fire on a lot of those things, but I think on the most important parts of it, um, I think you gave very respectable, rational, and consistent answers to it.
Agree with my views. Do you at least understand them now?
Yes, I do. Well, I did understand them to an extent already because, like I told you, I have a Buddhist friend who's purely secular, and we've actually had a lot of these conversations working at a town over dinner, and things like that. And he's really into Taoism and Buddhism and what is the I can't remember is it the Vedic with Hinduism, the Vedic. Um, he's really into a lot of the mystical things, but from a naturalistic, pragmatist point of view. So he's really similar in a lot of the views that you have, except for the fact that he's a vegan. And I haven't come up with a half-assed decent argument against him being a vegan. Um, and it pains me to admit that he has the moral high road because I hate the fact that we have to kill conscious, sentient beings for our pleasure. But damn, I love a steak, man. I just hot dogs,
Yeah.
hamburgers. I I literally you might find this
I
funny.
don't know about hot dogs. Those are pretty gross in my opinion, but yeah.
No, 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 no. You got to get the uncured all beef black Angus Oscar Mayers. Um, they're pretty good. But here's what's disturbing about all of it, Gaspar. I live literally next door to a small black Angus farm. I have black Angus cattle that come up to my fence and play peekaboo and hide and go seek with my daughters. And I'm literally sitting on the porch cooking hamburgers. And I'm like, man, you know what, y'all? Y'all are loud, you stink, but you're still living beings, you're sentient. But shit, your cousin tastes so good on my grill. Um, I'm just, I'm just, I'm just
Yeah.
immoral on that point. I'm just gonna admit it. The vegan has, I will readily admit, a vegan has a moral high road if they're doing it for moral purposes, and I'm just a moral failure in that area because I would love to be able to live my life. Well, no, I wouldn't love it. I would love to have the clear conscience, but bacon and sausage and I'm have I ever told you how good my steaks are? I cook some of the most phenomenal steaks. Now, I don't do a lot of things good, but a few things I do good is I smoke ribs. Really, really good being from Memphis. It's kind of like you eat ribs and drink bourbon in your bottle. Um, Dry rub ribs, I can smoke the shit out of them. I make my own dry rub. I can cook steaks. I'm very meticulous and methodical about the cuts of meat, the temperatures before I cook them, how long I cook them, all of these things. Um, but at the end of the day, man, while I'm eating my steak and I hear these bastards mooing next door, I don't feel bad for them. And I hate it because I want to feel bad for them. Lab grown meat. That is our next evolution in human morality. They're already working on lab grown steaks and shit. They just cost a lot of money. 3 hours, man. Holy crap. Gaspar, you have officially held me for the longest time of any interview I have ever done. This is going into the brute facts. I can't say Guinness World Book of Records. Brute facts World Book of Records. Fucking freaking. I'm sorry. Um,
Um,
a freaking Taoist, Buddhist, naturalist, nominalist, doesn't give a shit if he lives or dies as long as it works kind of guy. Yeah. Last question. Oh my God, he went to the audience. You gonna leave me hanging like, oh my God. I just literally tried to give you a high five and you just left me here hanging. All I wanted to know, Gaspar, before you went to the audience was it as good for you as it was for me? That's it. Um, that's all I want to know. So, anybody wants to talk, we can drop down to general, or we can hang out on the stage and people put their hands up. I don't care. We can go down to general. And for everybody else that's going to be listening after I edit the mess out of this because of Gaspar's dirty language and um, he's such a vile, evil, freaking atheist. Brutefacts.com. That's my website. Brute Facts on YouTube. Check it out. Tomorrow night, I have Trent Horn, the Canadian apologist. I did it again. Son of a bitch. I'm going to have to edit that.